Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we started talking about the IPsec. We talked about the benefits of using IPsec to secure the network infrastructure, regardless of whether the security is actually provided from the application or the transport layer point of view. Even if some applications are not using one of the application or transport layer security, we can still secure the entire traffic going in and out of the network. We discussed the overview of the IPsec standard in terms of all the documents that are bundled or part of the standard. We talked about two security modes for IPsec, the transport mode and the tunnel mode. And this is what we have discussed last time. We said that in the case of the transport mode, the encryption and or authentication is actually applied on the payload itself, which includes the data and the TCP header. And then you can add the ESP header and ESP authentication or the AH authentication. Or in the case of tunnel mode, where you actually apply the encryption and authentication to the entire IP packet, including the payload and the IP header. And in that case, you have to add an outer IP header. You have to repeat IP 2 times here. So because you have to provide an outer IP header, which is required by the intermediate routers to perform routing. What we have here. So first we apply ESP header and trailer, and the trailer here, as we said before, is used for padding, for random padding. And then after we apply the encryption, okay, then we can provide authentication. So authentication, or the MAC, the message authentication code, is actually applied to the entire packet, which is, in that case, it's a ciphertext. It's already encrypted, okay? So we add the authentication here to the already ciphered text, okay? So the text here is already encrypted, and then we apply the authentication, which means that the hashing itself is done on the ciphertext, not on the plain text, okay? In this graph, this particular authentication or MAC is actually done by AH in that case. But both of them are, again, in the transport mode, which means that they are using this this format here, okay? As we said, the ESP, or the encapsulating security payload, which is part of the standard, it can be used with or without authentication. So authentication as part of ESP is optional, and this is done for backward compatibility with AH, which was part of the standard at the beginning. So ESP itself can be used with or without authentication. So if ESP is used with authentication, the first user applies ESP to the data to be protected, and then appends the authentication field, which is so in the transport mode, the authentication and encryption apply to the IP header, whereas for the tunnel mode, the authentication applies to the entire IP packet, okay, which includes the data and the IP header, and in that case, there is an inner IP header and outer IP header, okay. The bottom line here is that for both cases, authentication applies to the ciphertext, okay. So the authentication here. So is there an issue with this, or is there an advantage, disadvantage? That's what we words here to discuss. So there is a concept of transport adjacency, or what we call SA bundle. By SA, as we discussed last time, SA stands for Security Association, which is the description of the security techniques and modes that we are using as part of the communication between two end hosts. So this security association can be bundled between ESP and AH. Okay, so we can, for example, use ESP for encryption and ESP also for authentication, or we can use ESP for encryption and AH for authentication. So that's what we need to describe here. So we can use two bundled transport security associations. So both of them are in the transport mode, and they are bundled together, which means that you have ESP header, which describes or refers to the security association for the ESP mode, okay? And there is another SA for authentication using AH. Both of them are in the transport mode. So in this case, ASP is used without its authentication. And as we said, authentication for the case of ESP is optional. So ESP can be used with or without authentication. Encryption is applied to the IP payload first, and then AH is then applied in the transport mode. Okay, and in that case, AH is only for authentication. Okay, AH is always used for authentication. And in that case, the authentication or the MAC calculation is done on the ciphertext. The advantage of this is that now authentication or the MAC calculation is done on more, can be done on more fields, because we first do the cipher or the ciphertext, and then we apply MAC on everything. So the MAC is calculated on more fields in that case. The disadvantage, of course, is the overhead of maintaining two security associations, one for ESP and one for AH. Okay, so that's the disadvantage in that case. Another way of bundling the security association is what we say transport tunnel bundle. So in that case, we are combining two types of security associations, one of them in the transport mode and the other one is in the tunnel mode. So the use of authentication, first we can apply AH on the transport mode. Okay, so in that case we did not do the encryption yet. Okay, so we can apply AH on the plain text, on the plain payload text. Okay, and then we can apply the ESP in the tunnel mode, which will include in that case the payload and the header, and then we can cipher everything. Okay, so that's another way of doing the exact same thing. In that case here, the claim is that this might have some advantage. إيه بقى الادvantage? Again, the difference here is that we are applying the authentication on the plain text, not the ciphertext. Okay, and then we can apply ESP, not necessarily in the transport mode, but even in the tunnel mode. We can do that. So in that case, the advantage is that it makes it hard for anyone to modify the MAC, okay, to give the impression that the data is actually altered. Okay, so you can, in that case, so if the MAC is exposed and it's done on the ciphertext, you can change the ciphertext and change the MAC, assuming that you can do that. Of course, if you are using a strong hash, you're not supposed to be able to do that easily, but assume that you can do that, then you can actually modify the MAC to give the impression that the data is the same, whereas the data has been modified. So this is what we mean by data integrity. But if the MAC is already ciphered, okay, if the MAC itself is ciphered, in that case, it makes it impossible for anyone to intercept the message and alter the content in any way, because even the MAC itself is already encrypted. So that makes it really very, very hard for anyone to affect the integrity of the data. The other advantage is that it may be desirable to store the authentication information with the message at the destination for later reference. يعني once we receive the entire packet and then we decipher, we get the MAC and the payload, right? So in some cases, you can store the message and the MAC on the receiver for later reference. Okay? So you can use that for later on communication. So you can store this in a cache, for example, and use it for later. So in that case, it's not possible to do that for the ciphertext. So there's no point to store in a cache the ciphertext. So it's better for you to store the plain text with the MAC or with the message authentication code. So another approach is to use a bundle consisting of an inner AH transport security association and an outer ESP head, this tunnel mode. So this is what we're talking about. So you can implement this by either applying AH first and then you can apply ESP either in the tunnel mode or either in the transport mode or in the tunnel mode. In other words, يعني the standards, it gives you the flexibility to bundle multiple SAs, okay, multiple security associations in any sequence you see appropriate. So you can apply authentication first, and then you can apply encryption after this. You can apply authentication in the transport mode and the encryption in the tunnel mode, or the other way around. ماشي كده؟ And for each case, you might, as a developer, find some advantages for some configuration over the other. So it's up to you. In all cases, you will still comply with the standard. So this is how it looks like graphically. So you can bundle multiple SAs in the transport mode. So from host to host, we said that from host to host, typically we use the transport mode. And in that case, you can use two SAs bundled together in the transport mode. You can use the transport mode bundled with the tunnel mode. Okay, so in the tunnel mode, we can apply the tunnel mode between the routers and the transport mode host to host. Okay, so all the combinations are possible from the IPsec point of view, and each one might have some advantage over the other depending on the application that we're talking about. The key here is that the tunnel mode is typically applied between routers or firewalls, versus the transport mode is typically applied host to host, يعني end to end. ماشي كده؟ Any questions? So that's when it comes to providing the basic security services for IPsec. So we can apply confidentiality, integrity, and authentication. When it comes to key management, which is another very important component, the standard uses what we call the Internet Key Exchange, or IKE. IKE is part of the IPsec standard, and there is IKE version 1, IKE version 2. So this is actually used for key management and distribution. So in that case, the key management portion of IPsec involves the determination and distribution of the secret keys. And for that, the IKE defines 4 different components or 4 different fields. 2 of them are for send and 2 are for receive, and each 2 provide confidentiality and authentication or integrity. Okay? So one key is used for encryption and the other one is used for authentication and integrity. The standard itself defines 2 types of key management and distribution. So For all cases, we need 4 keys for any communication between any 2 nodes. Okay, these keys can be provided either manually or in an automated way. So IKE itself supports automated protocol to generate these keys using what we call pseudo-random function. So the pseudo-random function is part of the standard, or you can actually provide that manually. So the administrator himself or herself can maintain these keys or generate these keys and distribute it manually to the different nodes. In that case, of course, the manual process, like static routing and dynamic routing kind of thing. So for static routing, it's also manual. So you can put the routes manual. But in that case, this applies only when the network is very, very small and the network does not change a lot. It's fixed. Okay? Whereas the automated way is more practical, more scalable, and it can work for large scale networks where you have dynamic network and the possibility of changes in the network is high. Okay? So that's so IKE itself is composed of 2 complementary components. Especially in IKE version 1, the standard actually talks about 2 components. One is called Oakley, and the other one is called ISAC-MP. Okay, the Oakley actually defines the mechanism for generating and exchanging the key, but it does not provide any specific message format that the transmitter and the receiver needs to exchange in order to create these keys or create the security association. So in other words, Oakley actually defines the mechanism, and the mechanism is easy. It's based on Diffie-Hellman. Okay? But as we have studied before, Diffie-Hellman has the limitation of what? It has the limitation of man-in-the-middle attack. So Diffie-Hellman does not resolve the man-in-the-middle attack. So if I come in the middle and send you a public key pretending that I'm a legitimate sender or receiver, and you send me a public key, and now we can generate a shared key, and I can encrypt and send you some messages back and forth, and we can communicate. Of course, this is the typical man-in-the-middle attack. And we said that man-in-the-middle attack, it gets resolved by authentication. So we have to authenticate ourselves to each other. I have to tell you that I'm a legitimate source of information, and you have to do the same. Okay? So the limitation of the Diffie-Hellman is overcome by the mutual authentication. So there has to be some mutual authentication that happens between any 2 communicating parties. So that's what Oakley actually describes. It's nothing but the fact that it says that Diffie-Hellman needs to be combined with mutual authentication using certain way. Okay? So that's what Oakley defines. So Oakley itself defines the key exchange protocol based on Diffie-Hellman algorithm, but integrated with it some added security for authentication. And authentication in that case is using certificates. So we have to send certificates, and as we said before, certificates actually is verifiable or verified by certificate authority. So when I send you my certificate, which is verified by the certificate authority, so you have some trust in this certificate authority, so you know that I'm a legitimate source of information. But Oakley itself does not provide any message types or message formats where we can perform this key exchange and certificates. Okay? So a complementary to this is ISAC-MP. So ISAC-MP stands for Internet Security Association and Key Management Protocol. So this is the actual protocol that defines different message types with format of each message, which the 2 parties need to send these messages to each other to exchange the public key as part of the Diffie-Hellman, the certificates, the security association parameters, and so on, as we will see in a minute. واضح كده? Okay. So those two, if they work with each other, then these two form what we call the IKE اللي هو مسؤول عن key management and distribution. In IKE version 2 standards, they actually removed the mention of Oakley and ISAC-MP, and they just kept IKE version 2, and they defined the message types, and in the message type they define the technique or the mechanism, but they don't refer actually whether this is Oakley or this is, because Oakley refers to the scientist who actually came up with this mechanism. And as part of this, as we will see, we also resolve or account for denial of service attack, as we will see in a minute. So this scientist actually came up with this mechanism where it resolves the denial of service attack, it resolves the replay attack, and it resolves the security limitations of Diffie-Hellman. Okay, so all of these are bundled or integrated in what we call the Oakley. But in version 2, they actually removed the mention of this Oakley mechanism, and they just left it as IKE version 2. That's it. So the algorithm is characterized by 5 important features. So the algorithm itself, or Oakley يعني, provides all these features, which are very, very important. So because of the fact that IP is connectionless and unreliable, okay, that makes it really tricky to try to avoid denial of service attack. Because if you are establishing a connection, then there is a connection context between the transmitter and the receiver. So anyone tries to get into this connection to try to send you multiple requests, you can easily ignore because you are connected to one party. But for the case of IP, because it's unreliable and it's connectionless, it makes this process a little bit tricky. So that's why they define a mechanism, a special mechanism, using what we call cookies. So cookies here are not for web cookies. These are totally different from the web cookies. So these cookies are used for mitigating the denial of service attack or the clogging attacks. Okay? So the fact that when I send you multiple messages, okay, again, we don't have to establish a connection. So anyone can send anyone multiple messages in very short time. Okay? And it makes it really tricky for you because we don't have connection. You're not expecting this message from a particular source because we don't have connection. Okay? So should you accept or not accept this message? Well, that's a tricky job. It's a tricky context here. That's why they have actually devised a special mechanism as part of the Oakley. They have defined a special mechanism called cookies. And in that case, any initiator or any sender can generate like a random cookie. This random cookie, even though it's random, but it depends on some IP fields, IP, sometimes the port and things like that, in such a way that makes it really hard for anyone to use any bogus IP address and pretend himself as a different IP and try to send you different messages from the same host. Yeah. So this random cookie fulfills this condition. Unfortunately, the details about the mechanism itself is not explained in the book. But the idea is this. The idea is the fact that this cookie, it gets generated randomly, but in such a way that it makes it hard for anyone to pretend himself as different IP if it's coming from the same host. Then, in that case, if you receive multiple messages from the same source, then your assumption is that this is retransmission, okay, because IP is unreliable, that this is retransmission, and this has to happen within a specific time frame. So if this time frame is very short, I'm going to reject these messages, okay? So I can allow the same source to send me the messages from the same cookie with specific frequency. And if this frequency increases above certain limit, then I'm going to reject it. And for each cookie, I have to establish a new security association. New security association gets created if I have enough resources. If I don't have enough resources, then I can assume that, again, I can reject this. So this way, this is the main idea. So this way, we can sort of mitigate the clogging attack, or mitigate the fact that I cannot get many messages in very short time from the same node. And this node is very hard for it to generate different cookies, because the cookies is dependent on the IP and the port as part of the packet, and it's very hard for any node to pretend that it uses different IP addresses. So that's part of the algorithm. Another thing is that it enables the two parties to negotiate a group. What is that group? Well, the Diffie-Hellman itself, as we said, Diffie-Hellman works, as we described before. We exchange a public key, okay? Based on this public key, we can calculate a shared key, صح? So that we described that before. So this public key itself, if it has a certain length, the larger this length is, the larger the shared key is, the more secure the communication will be, right? But of course, the larger this key is, the more complex the communication will be, right? So the overhead of the communication increases. So they define in the standard what we call Diffie-Hellman group. So for example, group 1 uses 500-bit public key length. Group 2 uses 1024-bit. Group 3 uses 2000, and so on. So as we increase the index of the group, this means that the public key length increases, hence the communication becomes more secure, but more overhead will be associated with that. So the Diffie-Hellman group is part of the initial messages that we need to exchange to agree or negotiate what Diffie-Hellman group we are going to use. Because based on that, the two communicating parties will define the key length, and hence the complexity associated with the the security of this communication. So one thing we negotiate, or we use cookies to resolve or mitigate the clogging attacks. 2, we negotiate the Diffie-Hellman group. 3, we use the nonces, and the nonces are used for what? For mitigating the replay attack. So nonces is just a random number which is sent at the beginning of the communication, or at the beginning of the authentication, to mitigate the replay attack. So, and then it enables also the exchange of the Diffie-Hellman public key. And then finally, it authenticates the Diffie-Hellman with some certificate to resolve the man-in-the-middle attack. So how that actually works. So that's the main protocol of IKE, and this is actually IKE version 2, because the sequence of these messages changes a little bit for the case of IKE version 1. So there are 3 main phases in that case. The first phase here, we try to exchange the Diffie-Hellman group. So this is the SAI1 is the Diffie-Hellman group, as it says here. Okay, so this is the Diffie-Hellman group. So we exchange. So the source, or we call it the initiator. Okay, the initiator will send the Diffie-Hellman group, and will send the public key, and will send the nonce. So this will give us what? This will mitigate the replay attack, and we exchange the public key, and we negotiate the Diffie-Hellman group. So the response will have the public key and again the Diffie-Hellman group and the nonce from the receiver side. So at this point, we have a shared key here and here, right? So at this point here, we have shared key on both sides because Diffie-Hellman facilitates the calculation of shared key between the initiator and the responder once they exchange the public key, right? So once we do that, we have a shared key established on both sides. This shared key will be used to encrypt all the upcoming messages. And the pair of messages after this, remember, we have mitigated the replay attack. We have done the exchange of the public key, but we did not do the authentication. Okay? So the authentication comes after as a separate step in the case of IKE version 2. Okay? So these two pair of messages, the main purpose of them is to do two things. One is to exchange certificates, okay? And to establish, this is the IPsec SA, okay? So the IPsec SA includes what type of encryption, what type of authentication, whether we're using ESP, AH, tunnel mode versus transport mode, whatever. Okay? And we perform authentication. So this is authentication as well as establishing the main IPsec security association for communication between the initiator and the responder. Okay? So those are the two main phases really. And using 4 messages only, we can do that. We can establish the shared key, and we can perform authentication, and we can establish the security association between the initiator and the responder. The third phase is required for what we call information management or communication management. Okay? So this is not as important. It's called child security association. This is needed for communication management. So if you want to send like error messages or any notification, so you send that on a separate communication stream. Okay, so these two are enough to establish data communication. Okay, so the IPsec SA is enough to establish data communication. But this is important for management, communication management. So if you want to send some configuration messages, delete messages, notify messages, things like that, then you establish what we call a child security association, and then you can use this security association to send configuration and notification messages. Part of this is where you send some error messages in case, remember the window technique that we talked about last time? If the window technique used for detecting replay attacks, if there is some kind of error, then you send this error over this communication management stream, okay? And that uses a separate security association, different from the main data communication. ماشي كده؟ So that's the main phases of the of IKE for key establishment and key distribution. Encryption as part of this message. Okay, this IKE اللي هي the IKE security association for these messages. طيب, as part of this, they define the techniques that are used to provide different security services. So there are two standards. This RFC define the mechanisms for VPN, whereas This one defines the mechanisms for the case of for USA. For USA, they have their own standards when it comes to security mechanisms for IKE and IPsec. Okay, so for this case, they provide two bundles of mechanisms. One is called VPN A, and the other is called VPN B. VPN B tends to have stronger security with respect to VPN A, and that's why you see that AES is used for everything. Okay, so AES, of course, is stronger in security and at the same time more efficient in terms of complexity. So here as well, they tend to use a larger key, or at least the same key. So here, for example, for the case of Diffie-Hellman group, so they use higher group. So the size of the public key in that case is 2048, which means that we use stronger security. So everything here uses similar or at least more efficient or stronger security compared to VPN-A. We have for encryption, for AES encryption, for data integrity, for MAC calculation, and then for IKE encryption, we have the pseudo-random function. As we said, pseudo-random function is used to generate any random numbers as part of the standards. And of course, IKE integrity, a message authentication code for the IKE. And finally, the Diffie-Hellman group, okay, which is negotiated as part of the IKE Security Association establishment. ماشي? So those are the services. Same services here, but in that case, أمريكا بقى طبعا لازم فهم for the National Security Agency in the United States, they defined different set of mechanisms. One part is called GNC, which is valid for, they call it sensitive data unclassified. And another one which is for sensitive data classified information. They have two types of techniques. And for each type, you can see that the sizes are increasing to indicate stronger security in that case. So each of these correspond to this. However, they have two classification of this, one for unclassified information and the other one is for classified information. These are details, you don't have to memorize them. It's just that, just some idea why they do it this way.
What is the IKE-DH group link?
Diffie-Hellman group. The Diffie-Hellman group, as we said, Diffie-Hellman itself varies according to the size of the public key that we exchange, right?
It's less than 1024.
Less than 1024?
It's 256, right?
Fin, where?
For example, first one.
Here?
Yes.
Here?
Yes.
Yeah, so
it's less than 1000.
This is the size of the public key. So again, the larger this length is, the stronger the security is. Okay, so you can have any arbitrary size public key, but the larger the key is, the stronger the communication will be, or the security will be. So you have the flexibility to use whatever, and it could be that the 256-bit, because this is 256-bit ECB, versus here 1000 MODP. We don't know the difference between ECP and MODP, so it could be that MODP and ECP are some function that is applied to the public key to generate the shared key. So again, we need to look up this RFC and get the exact terminology and what is the difference between MODP and ECP and all this stuff. So any questions so far? So that's basically the IP6. So again, we discussed the main standards for IPsec. the encapsulating security payload, ESP, which can be used for encryption and can optionally be used for authentication as well. And we applied that in two different modes, the transport mode and the tunnel mode. And then we talked about AH, I mean roughly, because we did not talk about the details of AH, of course. But we know that AH is used only for authentication, and it was part of the standards at the beginning, and then later on they left it for backward compatibility. Then we can bundle, or we can mix between ESP and AH in different modes to provide encryption and authentication in different levels, or in the same level, and using different order. And based on the order and based on the modes, we can provide different levels of security for IPsec. Okay? So that's the summary of this chapter. So we can talk briefly about this is the last chapter. So intrusion detection systems. So for intrusion detection systems, we cover the main concept of intruders. Intruders are hackers that use unsystematic way of breaking into the system infrastructure or the network itself. So they don't necessarily use eavesdropping on using cryptanalysis. That's not the only thing that they use. They use different ways. They can log on to using unauthorized type of access to a workstation, and they can use that workstation to gain access to some resources on the network. They can read some sensitive information, like, for example, credit card information or password file from a database, and they can do all sorts of things. So despite the fact that we have learned in this course different protocols and standards which we can use to secure the communication at different levels, for example, we can provide security from the application point of view, so we can use some application level security. But again, we're not enforcing all applications to use that protocol. We can provide security at the transport layer, but again, that's not a guarantee that you are enforcing security on all types of applications, because if these applications do not use that particular transport protocol, then they can use no security in services in that case. Okay? So if you do all of this and then you provide information security in a primitive way, like, for example, you can allow the users in a specific organization to use trivial kind of passwords, then again, all the protocols that we talked about, they are driven by some authentication. And if this authentication is broken, you can get access to the keys, you can get access to the communication, and you can break into the communication, and you can also have access, unauthorized access to some sensitive information. So in that case, we need second line of defense. Okay, so we need some second line of defense. So we know that we can, despite all the security protocols that we have studied so far, there could be some vulnerability in the system, either in the software or in the hardware. So you have secured everything, but you left, like one of the modems, it does not use network access security protocol for some reason. So someone can get to this modem and connect and have access to the network and do whatever he wants. So we need some second line of defense. So in case someone detects some vulnerability in the system, either software or hardware, we need to be able to get some trigger that there is some kind of a suspicious access or suspicious type of communication on the network somehow. Okay? So we need a way or a mechanism to get alerts once some suspicious communication happens. And if we can detect or get this alarm as quickly as possible, we can stop the intruder from really conducting any kind of unauthorized access to sensitive information, or can harm the network infrastructure or something like that. So the book actually classifies intruders. Intruders are all types of hackers that do not necessarily use cryptanalysis for breaking into the communication. They can perform some unauthorized access through logging on to a workstation, either locally or through the network. Okay? And from this workstation, they can penetrate the network. They can have access to sensitive information, or they can inject false information into the network. So the book actually classifies intruders into three different categories. One is called masquerader. The masquerader is an individual who is not authorized to use a computer. So he's an external person, external person who gains access to a workstation in illegitimate way. Okay, and from that they can penetrate the system access control. So they can, for example, get access to the user's password or some sensitive information. So the masquerader is an external person who can gain access to a workstation in an unauthorized way. The misfeasor is actually an internal person. This person is authorized person, and we'll talk about some cases where an authorized person can in fact abuse his access to try to use that authorized access to gain access to information which he or she is not supposed to do. So in that case الماسكريدر اللي هو بنسميه بالعربي اللي هو المتنكر whereas the misfeasor is the facet اللي هو the person who's internal to the group, but he wants to corrupt or destroy the whole group. Okay. So the misfeasor is a legitimate user who accesses data, programs, or resources for which such access is not authorized. Okay, or who is authorized for such access but misuses that. He has access to some password file, he gets this password file and then he gives it to you. Okay, here is that. So that's a misuse of information that you have access to, and you have misused this access. Clandestine user is a root. This person is the most dangerous, and usually this type of intruders are the most difficult to detect, as we will see later. The clandestine user is an individual who seizes supervisory control of the system and uses this control to evade. He has access to centralized logs and auditing logs and so on. So he can use this control to evade the auditing and access control, or to suppress auditing collection. Basically, the clandestine user, that's a good question. The clandestine user can be an internal user. A misfeasor can use his authorized access to get root access. In that case, he will be elevated to clandestine user. Or an external, اللي هو بقى masquerader, he can try to break into the system and try to get root access. Okay, and in that case, he or she will be labeled a clandestine user because he gained root access, but he was actually an external person. So in other words, those are the two main categories, and the third one can be either of them, but he can break into the system in such a way that he can be labeled a clandestine user. So if either of these users is able to gain root access, then he will be elevated to clandestine user. The reason for this is that later on there is a study that a person has done, I think in the 80s. And he actually tried to analyze the difficulty of detecting different type of intrusions according to these categories. And the conclusion was masquerader is easy to detect, in a way, okay? Misfeasor, well, it's easy if we use very sophisticated techniques, but it's not يعني straightforward. So if you use
log file, for example, for the network access, cannot detect misfeasor.
Yes.
the log file,
Log file for any transaction happen on the network.
okay.
So you can easily detect the misfeasor, I guess. So
Well, it depends. ما هو again, log files ديت, as we will see later, there are some techniques from the log file. You can apply certain rule-based detection. So you can say, according to this line, if the transaction has this criteria, then well, alert, there is some kind of intrusion. Or you have to look at the entire log file and then convert this log file into what we call بقى features. يعني try to do some statistics. Okay, so it's not straightforward as looking at one line. You have to look at the whole history and get some statistics about the log, the history. And then from this history, you can evaluate or estimate some features. And then from the features, you say, we can really classify that there is an intrusion or not. And this intrusion might sometimes be associated to a specific user. So, or it might be general to all users. Okay? So sometimes the intrusion is actually user-based. So we can detect a certain behavior for user to be normal versus certain behavior for other users, which might be an attack. Okay? So we in that case, the statistics or the intelligence that we do is based on the profile of the. And sometimes we can do this statistics in such a way that's generic, irrespective of the user information or the user behavior. The quick answer to your question is that it depends. Okay, it depends. It's not 100% guaranteed. So these are the three categories. And again, to go back to this study, they say that again misfeasor is possible given some non-straightforward techniques, and it has to be sophisticated techniques based on statistical information. And clandestine is really, really hard to detect. Really, really hard to detect. Okay, they are not saying it's impossible, but it's really, really hard to detect. Okay. So examples of intrusion: we can perform a remote root compromise of an email server. So you can log on to an email server, and in that case, in unauthorized way, and using like some kind of masquerade. And in that case, you can gain access to emails of the people, the body, and then from these emails you can get some sensitive information, and then from this sensitive information you can launch another level of attack and so on. Defacing a web server really changes the look and feel of a web page. So you can overwrite a certain web page and change the content. So if you try to access this web page, you see that the look and feel of this web page is totally deformed or changed. So that's some type of attack. And it happens, people, they try to access a certain URL, and then you get warning, this page has been compromised and ransom, and you have to pay this and so on. I get كده. Guessing and cracking a password, copying a database containing credit card numbers or some kind of a password. So these types of sensitive information is, of course, advisable not to be stored as plain text in the database. So we know that we can encrypt this during communication. So that's That's no-brainer. We know that. But storing this locally as plain text passwords or credit card information is also not not good. So for these types of information, we will talk about some recommendations that you can use, you can store, and we actually talked about that when we talked about Kerberos. We said that password files are used in some cases like hashed, or in some using like one-way hashed that it's not reversible, so you can never reverse the hash into a password again, so you can never know the password. And this hash is used for those who know the password, and they can convert it to the hash to use it for verification. So this way, that's the easiest way. So this way you cannot really read the password file. You can verify, but you cannot reverse and get the password file, the password in any way. So viewing sensitive data, including the payroll records, and so these are sensitive information that we call this type of intrusion benign. يعني if you read the payroll records, you know some information that you're not supposed to know, but it does not affect badly anyone. So we call that benign intrusion or intruder. Benign intruder is like a person who's really, he's reading sensitive information, but he cannot use this sensitive information to really damage their network or gain unauthorized access to other types of systems. But if he gains access to password file or password database, that's big, because he can use this password to gain root access in some cases and perform further damage to the system. Okay, so that's what we call malignant intruders. So they also classify the intruders into benign versus malignant intruders. Running a packet sniffer on a workstation to capture username and passwords. And in some cases, that does not require any crypto analysis. You can just sniff, and from the packet, you can see the plain text, assuming that you're not using any kind of encryption in that case. So these are software types of attacks, but it doesn't stop at this point. You can actually dial up to a modem that's does not use network access control for authentication, for example. And when you dial that, you gain access, unauthorized access to the network. So in that case, you can access the network, and you can read resources and perform further damage. Posing an executive, calling the help desk. This is neither software nor hardware. Someone picks up the phone and he tries to impersonate another person and try to please reset my password, and send it to me by email. Some kind of and using unattended logged-in workstation without permission. So this is a type of misfeasing or misfeaser who actually gains access to a legitimate workstation which is already logged on, and in that case you can use it for further attack. As we said, the intrusion can be benign, and in that case, a benign user, they can consume resources, they can read information, but they cannot use this information really to launch further more damaging attacks, let's say. So you can consume resources from the system, you can read some sensitive information, but it stops at this point. You cannot really use that to to perform further damage in the network infrastructure. Versus malignant, you can actually gain sensitive access to sensitive data like credit card information, like password files, like hardware type of access, which allows you to damage the whole performance of the network, or you can use credit card information to steal money from a person, or you can use the password file to gain root access to some servers, and from that you can launch another large-scale attack. So, given this, as we said, and despite all the security protocols that we have studied so far, there will still be some vulnerability in the system as a whole. So we need second level of defense, second line of defense. And that could be done in two ways. One is to use what we call intrusion detection systems or intrusion prevention systems. The difference is easy. The intrusion detection systems is that these are techniques that they run into on the entire system, and then they monitor the communication and the behavior. And then based on some certain rules or based on some certain statistics, they say that there is some kind of suspicious communication going on. And in that case, they can either give that to a person to decide whether this intrusion is actually malignant or benign or something like that. And based on that, they perform the proper action. Okay? Or for intrusion prevention system, there are some automated mechanisms, not only for detection, but in that case for prevention. So you can perform certain reaction based on the type of intrusion. So you can automate the process of stopping this intrusion as well. That's one way, which is, as we said, this is the second line of defense. Another way is what we call, and this is, by the way, defined as part of the organization. We have what we call CERTs. CERTs are computer emergency response teams. These teams, their responsibility is just to try to analyze the system and come up with a vulnerability report. Okay? So they try to somehow detect all the vulnerability in the system, okay? And not detect by the behavior or the suspicious communication. They detect gaps and holes in the system that intruders might use to break into the system. And then they perform what we call a vulnerability report. This vulnerability report will be disseminated to the decision makers to try to perform the proper measures to close these holes and gaps, to make it harder for the intruders to break into the system. So it's like performing this function in a way manually, or they run some analysis and then they come up with reports. But the problem is that these reports are, in a way, public reports, and in many ways, some misfeasors, especially misfeasors who are internal into the system, they can read these CERT documents, and they can use it to know where are the gaps, where are the holes, and they can use that to break into the system. ماشي كده؟ So, of course, in this chapter, we will cover this part. So we will cover the second line of defense, where we want to detect the suspicious communication using different ways. As we said, it could be rule-based or statistical-based, and in some cases, طبعا, as we all know, we can use machine learning techniques, and we can use this and that. So we'll talk about some possible implementations, how we implement these intrusion detections. Sometimes these intrusion detections can be implemented in like a firewall, and in that case it's in a way centralized. The problem in that case is that all the traffic has to go through this firewall to perform this intrusion detection, and of course that will cause some kind of bottleneck. Or these intrusion detections can be in a distributed way, in which case we don't actually load one single entity with all the traffic from the system, but we can distribute that across different entities, and in that case it would be more efficient. However, you have to make sure that you can synchronize the rules and the statistics between all these intrusion detection mechanisms or algorithms. Unstop. So we'll have 2 or 3 slides and then we'll stop. So, of course, hackers or intruders, they can work individually, in which case some intruders are just motivated by the fact that they want to just do damage and that's it. But some intruders are what we call criminal hackers, is that they work in groups. And these groups, they identify certain target or targets in different systems all over the world, and they try to use their own experience or background to try to break into these systems, and then later on either to perform damage or to blackmail the person or the group to gain certain money or monetary gain or something like this. So these criminal hackers, they have specific targets or at least classes of targets in mind. Once a site is penetrated, the attacker acts quickly. So if I gain access to the password file, then I'm going to use that quickly to access a certain workstation, and from this workstation, I want to get the credit card information and do this and this and this. So they actually provide certain targets, and they run these systematic steps one after the other in a systematic way. And they try to do that very quickly. So because the quicker you do it, the less chance will be for any kind of IDS system or IBS system to perform any countermeasures for these types of attacks. If the attacker penetrates the system very quickly and run these systematic steps to gain access to the information and damage the system very quickly, it leaves you no room or time to prevent these types of attacks. So in that case, we try to mitigate that by, again, automated steps, either for IDS or for IBS. So we try to have some automated steps in place. So relying on certs or relying on these emergency teams to detect vulnerability and provide reports and then take certain actions, this will take time. So providing IDS and IBS automates some kind of a systematic process to detect these intrusions whenever they happen, although some of them might be very, very hard to detect, but it closes certain gaps in the system. So this slide really touches like some individual issues. It's like insider attacks. These are certain types of attacks which it's very hard to detect. As we said, it's like it depends on misfeasors who try to abuse or misuse their access in causing some damage to the system. So this can be in many cases with the motivation of revenge. So a certain employee he gets fired. Okay, so he tries to react to this. So I will take revenge. So I still have access. So he goes back to his desk. He uses this access to attack and to perform damage. So misuses certain information. So he or she has access, like in a bank or something. He has access to certain resources. So he can use that access to get these resources and give it or announce it somewhere, like the attack that happens in QMB or something. I'm not saying that it's insider or outsider. I don't know, but these can be the motivation, especially internal attackers or misfeasors. They can perform that as a result of certain revenge, or in some cases feeling of entitlement. They feel like they are downgraded or underestimated, and they need like more authority or more gain, and they are sort of misjudged or something like this. So they can take revenge and get this information and give it to the competitor, or to try to misuse this information in some way. So So insider attacks are actually a big issue in certain organizations. And in some cases, the mitigation for this could be treat people fairly, or you try to say, I'm not going to do that. So you just cover your head and try to take other actions, and these are the actions in that case. So you can do some enforcement. You can try to close, enforce least privilege. So in some cases make the life of people miserable and try to make the privilege really limited. That if you want to, if you have even a workstation and you want to set up a software on this workstation, no, you have user privilege and you cannot. So if you want to do this, you have to go to a certain location to set it up for you. Set logs so that users access what commands they are entering, or try to give some verbose kind of logs that if there is any kind of attack, that insider attack that happens, you have all the information that allows you to know exactly what went wrong and what they did and so on. So you can hold them accountable, or you can sue them, or you can do some action against them. Protect sensitive resources with strong authentication. So you can do like 2-level authentication or 3-level authentication in some cases. Like in our case, sometimes even in the email basic service, now you have 2 levels of authentication, and so you can strengthen the security more and more. And in some cases, this adds very big complexity and overhead on accessing the services. طبعا some people when they it happens everywhere الحقيقة if some people they get fired, they take them away from their desks. I'm not sure if some of you are aware of this. It happens everywhere الحقيقة. So they take them away from their desks. Unfortunately, you are fired, but you cannot go back to your desk because everything is disabled and you cannot use anything in the company from now on. So everything is deleted and you cannot use it.
And also they want the other employees want to talk about.
Yeah.
This is something that I knew.
Yes.
And if you talk to them, you are considered violated or fired as well.
Yes, because if they talk to you, not you. If they talk to the person who was fired, he can motivate them to be in the same state, or he can say, someday this is going to happen to you, or please try to use your access to help me gain revenge, or something like this. So they can influence other people and motivate them to do harm to the infrastructure. So upon termination, delete employees' computer and network access right away, as we said. So this happens immediately, and the person is not allowed to gain access to anything anymore. Upon termination, make a minor image of the employee's hard drive before reissuing it. So later on, if that person goes to a competitor and tries to use this information otherwise with the competitors, like مثلا certain IP, he can get some code that has certain IP, and he can go to the competitor and try to use that. So by storing an image of this, you can later on say, no, we own this, and we have some evidence that we own all these IPs and resources. Therefore, you cannot use them. And by the fact that this employee was actually working as part of our organization, he was getting paid to produce these IPs, then the ownership of these IPs is for our organization, not yours. So the standard is, if you work for a certain organization and you use your intellectual to produce certain IP, then the ownership of this IP goes to the organization. In many cases, it goes to the organization. So because you are getting paid to produce this. Of course, you can benefit from this indirectly but the main ownership of this IP goes usually to the organization. So these insider attacks, or what we call them misfeasors, are not straightforward to detect. So these are preventive measures that you can do, but again, these are not necessarily enough to make your infrastructure proof of any types of attacks. So, as we said, intrusion techniques, the objective of intruder is to gain access to a system or to increase the range of privileges accessible by him or her. So most initial attacks use system or software vulnerabilities that allow the user to gain access, for example, to a password file or to a certain database with credit card information, sensitive information. So one of the actions to mitigate this is by saying, okay, so even if you gain access to a database and get some credit card information, you won't be able to, because the credit card information are stored in some way that's not accessible. And one of the ways is either to do one-way kind of hashing to the password. So from the password you can store the hash of this password. So one-way hash, as we have studied before, is not reversible. So we can never reverse the hash and know the password, okay? But you can still use the hash for verification, and that's what we've been doing. We've been doing the authentication by verifying the hash, right? So you can still do that for the password. So whenever you want to verify the password, all you need to do is just to apply the same hashing technique and then compare the hash. Assuming that you know the correct password, then you will produce the same hash, in which case you will be able to verify. If you change the password slightly, then you will not produce the same hash, in which case the verification will fail. So in which case your access will fail, and that's what we want. So if you gain access to the password database, what you will see are hashes. So you cannot reverse the hash and know the password in any way. So you have to know the correct password to produce this hash. Okay? So that's a way of securing, and same thing goes to credit card information or any other sensitive information. Or, of course, in 90% or more than 90% of the cases, this is what happens, really. And I worked on many systems in Canada and many places. These are the proper systematic way of storing any passwords in the database. This is the most efficient. Another way of doing that is access to the password file is limited to one or more few accounts, in which case, again, a clandestine user or a certain intrusion can happen to these accounts as well, and then you can gain access to this password database or password file, in which case you will have access to these passwords and you can use them to launch further attacks.
So how are we protecting the access in this case? If it's from the inside, you will already have the gain from the user that already has access.
Right.
So how is this a way to protect the person?
Because as we said, this is limited. You are limiting the access to the password file to certain accounts that you trust. The only one who has access to this is person XYZ, who is the admin. So if there is a break in the system, he did it. There's no other possibility, but because he did it or someone else gained unauthorized access through his account, and that's what we call clandestine user. Okay, so it's very hard to detect in that case. Either the same person did it, which means that he is an insider, or another clandestine user who might be an outside user who gained unauthorized access through that account. In which case, you cannot do anything. What can you do? So the intrusion detection, starting from here, we'll talk more technical on these intrusion. Not today, next time. We'll talk more in technical about the intrusion detections, how they can be as a second line of defense, and how they can perform some systematic ways of detecting these intrusions. And these are based on assumption that the behavior of the intruders is somehow different from the behavior of the legitimate user. That's the assumption now. Okay? That assumption is really يعني vague. يعني it's not concrete. Or it does not hold 100% of the time. But يعني the behavior of a legitimate user is that he logs in, he can access his email, he can access. But if a person tries to log in 3-4 times in a short time, well, that's fishy. If a person tries to log on and then after logging on, he tries to gain access to a certain server which stores credit card, no, that's not. That's suspicious. Things like that. So the assumption here for intrusion detection is that the behavior of a legitimate user and the behavior of the intruder, they are different in a way. So based on these differences, we can try to detect that there is an intrusion. So the consideration, if an intrusion is detected quickly enough, the intruder can be identified and ejected. Because sometimes the preventive action based on the intrusion is not necessarily automated or systematic. Intrusion detection enables the collection of information about intrusion techniques that can be used to strengthen the intrusion prevention. This is what I was telling you. When an intrusion happens, then you can take, you can analyze the logs and try to identify how this intrusion actually happened. Based on that, you can use this analysis to close vulnerability in the system. So you can say this person logged on to this workstation and he used this particular user ID and password, and from that he launched a connection to this server and so on and so forth. So where is the gap? The gap is that password was weak. Oh, okay, so fix that password. Or the gap was the connection from this workstation to this server does not require secure authentication. Or the access of this workstation to the network does not enforce network access level security, which means that the port that this workstation uses to connect to the network is not secure. It does not enforce any authentication technique or something like this. So fix that. Okay. So by looking at the file, you can sort of identify how this intrusion actually happened, and then based on that you can react and perform. But I mean, again, this reaction might take time. So the quicker the intrusion happened, and the quicker this analysis could happen, the faster you can countermeasure this and close or eject the user from being able to at least launch further attacks. And if you detect an intrusion and you know that there is some attack happened, don't leave it there. خلاص he gained access to some accounts. Don't give him the chance to access other accounts. Try to perform something. Okay. So that's the this describes this issue. So this is the profile of an intruder behavior, and this is the profile of a legitimate user. Okay. So there is some kind of overlap, and this overlap is the tricky part, because you can, for example, perform the IDS or the intrusion detection based on some loose criteria, which tries to detect all types of intrusion. But if you do this, the criteria is loose enough that some legitimate behavior of authorized users can be classified as intrusion by mistake, which is what we call a false positive. Okay? So that's what we call false positive. Okay? The other way is that again the legitimate user can be also classified as intrusion by mistake. Okay? Which is what we call false negative. So this overlap causes some kind of a confusion that the more accurate IDS system should try to minimize this area, should try to minimize this overlap and minimize the false positives and false negatives. ماشي كده؟ So that's the main issue. So you can do that by not only relying on straightforward rule-based criteria. In many cases, this requires the fact that you have to take certain statistics and history in account in order to make your classification more and more accurate. And that's why, طبعا, in many cases, machine learning performs really very high or performs really well, because machine learning really tries to maximize the accuracy based on detecting some accurate features based on which the classification accuracy will be high. And the good thing is that, or the good news for the developers or people like us, is that not like in the past, we have to really think deeply to try to come up with features and calculate the features and so on. Like machine learning will do all of this naturally for us. So we don't have to really think about engineering these features. So there are some machine learning techniques that will learn the features. You don't have to even, so you just give it the logs, give it the data set, and the machine learning techniques will learn and will come up with the best set of features and use that to classify and maximize بقى the accuracy and اللي هو بيسميها يعني minimize بقى the false positive and false negative and so on. Okay. So that's so the rest of the, so we'll stop here, but the rest of the chapter talks about the difference in implementing these IDS systems, زي ما قلنا, centralized versus distributed, and how we can do that. Talks about specific IDS mechanisms. There are a few slides. I think the next